For 40 years, we have been lied to about women and men, about domestic violence, about sexual assault, about privilege, about rights, even about the very idea of equality. Erin Pizzey, who founded the world's first internationally recognized battered women's shelter, has known all along that something's wrong, because she witnessed the change herself back in the early 1970s. Today, she talks to many younger men and women who have been hurt by hateful and dishonest gender ideology, and she has a question for them. When did you wake up? And how long have you been awake? And of course, what should we do about it now? Welcome to When Did You Wake Up with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Saturday, October 25th, 2014 edition of When Did You Wake Up with Erin Pizzey. I am Dean Esme, Erin's trusty sidekick. Erin, are you with us this fine day?
I definitely am, and I'm looking forward to talking to Ed.
Excellent. Yes, speaking of Ed, our guest today is Dr. Edward Rhymes. Now, Dr. Rhymes received his PhD from the University of Berkeley in sociology with a concentration in critical race theory and Black studies. He is also the author of a book from Author House Publishers called When Racism is Law and Prejudice is Policy: Prejudicial and Discriminatory Laws, Decisions, and Policies in U.S. History. I mean, Erin, he has not joined us today to discuss that issue per se, although I see no reason we can't wander into that area if you guys want to. Instead, what brought Dr. Rhymes to our attention is a wonderful, a very moving and rather gut-wrenching essay called I Remember Mama, One Man and Boy's Odyssey Through Abuse, where Dr. Rhymes goes through, and we're going to call him Ed, he said we could, goes through really a very moving story of a very difficult childhood. Are you there, Dr. Grimes?
Yeah, I'm right here. How's everybody?
I'm doing great. So, Erin, I know you read Ed's Odyssey.
I did, and I was crying all the way through it, because apart from that, anything else, it's beautifully written, and it's very brave, because it's women like myself who had narcissistic exhibitionist mothers who were cruel and violent find it very easy to talk about it. But for men, it's really hard for them to be absolutely honest about their relationships with their mother, because it's a taboo subject among men. So when I read it, and it's so beautifully put, and the show, as you know, is called When Did You Wake Up? And I wanted to ask you about being an 8-year-old and what you called an epiphany. What happened?
Yeah. Well, I remember, and I can't remember verbatim, word for word, the things that were being said to me at the time, the way that I was being verbally abused by my mother at the time. But I did have an epiphany as an 8-year-old kid. It just flashed across my mind that no longer will your opinion of me be my opinion of me. That you don't get to define who I am. I get to define that. And as an 8-year-old, I mean, to me, it was miraculous, because I know many people, and I've worked with many people going through abuse. And whenever I tell them that I got that epiphany at 8 years old, it kind of shocks them.
I don't normally interrupt, but you just made me gasp. 8?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it came to me at 8 years old. And I just kind of looked at her. And it just dawned upon me. Now part of the epiphany, I do believe, was rooted in my maternal grandmother, her mother, was very much different from her. And we had a very close relationship. So when I looked at her, and she did not define to me the type of person I wanted to have that sort of say-so in my life, even though she was my mother. And having grown up, the first 6 years of my life in a foster home, I had and it was a actual home, with two parents, who very much, they wanted to adopt me. So we were very close as well, too. So I had some experience with how normal or how loving relationships between parent and children took place. And I knew that this was out of the ordinary. So things had rooted me in an idea, and it had rooted me in an understanding that, wait a minute, at 8 years old, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And I can't let her define who I am. And from that point on, it became a whole lot easier. Even though the abuse didn't stop, it became a whole lot easier for me to detach myself from the definition she was trying to label me with. No good.
I was going to ask you, because it seems to me what had already happened for you, you'd been validated by the loving couple. So you actually knew who you were, which is probably why you woke up. I mean, I woke up at 4.5, and I looked at my abusive mother, and I said, I thought to myself, I don't even like you. I don't even like the way you smell. And she could see in my eyes that I'd sussed her. It made her more violent, but it kept me safe.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that when I read your movie, and I was brought to tears by your story as well. When I read your piece, you talk about how you looked a whole lot like your father, so a lot of that was taken out on you. Yeah. I look exactly like my mother, which was my wife almost fell over the first time she saw my mother because, like, my God, it's a female version of you. We look, line for line, wrinkle for wrinkle face, everything. I look exactly like my mother. And so it must have been some pretty deep-rooted pain and anger and hostility towards me that made her lash out at me as she did, because I looked just like her.
But do you know what created her?
Yeah. I look back on my mother's life, and, it was no picnic. My grandfather was not available for her emotionally. My mother was one of 14 children, so an unavailable father who left, when she was a teenager, just going into her teenage years, had left, to find work elsewhere, but didn't come back home. Stayed in contact with the family, but he was not present. And she watched him in her earlier years. He was an alcoholic. Yeah. He went through AA. And, really, and he wasn't a mean drunk from what my grandmother told me about him. But, he was, there's some insecurity when you're dealing with an alcoholic, no matter how mean or how nice they are. There's still some instability there. So she was dealing with.
How about her mother?
Oh, my grandmother was firm, but loving. She was from her, I believe, from my grandmother, I derived my sense of justice. Of right and wrong, that some things are just not right and some things are wrong. And my grandmother, to me, was a perfect example because she had gone through a lot of what I've gone through. Yeah. She was passed family member to family member in the South. In the segregated South. That's where my grandmother grew in Tennessee. And she had a rough time of it coming up, but you wouldn't know it the way she carried herself.
What you're saying,
so it's a very different reality. Than the one that my mother had. My grandmother responded very differently than my mother did to that turmoil in her life.
Well, in a way, what you're saying is that your grandmother transcended it.
Yes.
Her background, and your mother didn't. She failed to.
Yeah. And what I've always said when I've dealt with people, there are many things that can explain, why behaviors are so. But none of those things excuse the behavior or the bad choice.
Absolutely. You have a choice. And you can choose to transcend, or you can choose not to. But I think we are in the 21st century are far better off than, say, my parents. I'm 75 now. They didn't have the psychological understanding about behavior and how to rear children that we have now. So it's even less excuse for us.
Yeah, it really is.
And this whole concept of saying no to any sort of abuse, be it men or women, and children have to be brought up in peace and in harmony, because otherwise I don't want any. I don't know about you, but we didn't have a childhood. It was simply born into a war that was no fault of ours, and the damage. That's where the damage is generational, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, I didn't grow up during a war, but I grew up in a war zone. I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, you deal with that in the streets of Chicago, and then you come home and you don't feel quite safe either. So there wasn't, the only safe place I really had was with my grandmother. And my favorite uncle, my Uncle Clifford, played a very phenomenal role in my life. My mother's brother played a very profound role in my life. From him, I knew that it was possible to grow up in a war zone, and still hold on to your dignity, and still be able to be a person of integrity and a person of character. He taught me that just by his example. So, I wasn't without, as I wrote in the piece, I wasn't without safe havens or human refuge in my life, but
That's
I had
wonderful.
to make the decision to take advantage of those refuges.
Yeah.
Because there's many people who have that refuge as well. They didn't take advantage of it. I, as a child, knew I had to take advantage of any lifeline that was thrown to me. Any lifeline that was thrown to me, I had to take advantage of it. And that primarily, that's what I did in school. When a lifeline was thrown to me, I took advantage of it. I became very academically involved. So there were lifelines that were thrown to me that I had to make the decision, am I going to take advantage of these lifelines or not? And so that's pretty much what helped me throughout my childhood.
Well, it interests me that you're talking about the fact that you were already aware that it was abnormal because you had normal experiences. The problem for so many children is they have no idea that what they're going through is abnormal.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but it's extraordinary. The 3 children in our family, we never talked about the abuse to each other. And my brother never, all his life, ever talked about it. And he died young. Thank God my sister and I can now. How about you in your relationships?
Well, I had one younger brother who came along when I was 11 years old. So there's a big age difference between he and I. And we were treated very differently. As a matter of fact, if you would have a conversation with a great many people in my family, if you talk to them about me, one of the first things that comes out of practically everyone's mouth is, well, your brother was treated a whole lot better than you were. And he was. She was a whole lot nicer to him. And he got, a lot of the attention that I didn't get. I was never jealous of that. It never really bothered me that he did. What bothered me was the injustice of her attitude towards me.
Yeah.
But to make a long story short, that kind of attention that he was getting as well was pretty toxic, even though it seemed positive on the outside. And my younger brother, 3 years ago, at 32 years of age, was shot and killed 18 to 21 times in Chicago. I lost him 3 years ago to gun violence.
So he didn't really. Did he transcend your mother? No. But you know what?
He really.
Something I've always blessed. I've got to say this to you because this will make sense to you. Something that I thought was very blessed for me is that at 4.5 I realized she was a very damaged woman. Now the other 2. She basically was never as cruel to the other 2 as she was to me because I looked like my father. And in the end of the day, I was the one that was saved because she actually she cannibalized the other 2 children.
Exactly.
And that is, the word toxic's absolutely right. In a sense, they were both addicted to her.
Yeah. Well, my uncle, it was, I had an uncle, not my Uncle Clifford, but my Uncle Earl. We were talking right after my brother's funeral. And we were talking on the phone. And he was saying what I just said. Well, boy, she lavished a lot of, she didn't treat him the way she treated you. And I told him something. I said, you know what? I said, I believe God spared me of her tender graces, And he stopped for a moment. He said, you know what? Maybe you're right. I said, yeah, that sort of love I did not need.
Well, it isn't love. It isn't love, actually. That's
it's not. No.
And I think the other thing, I've often said this, you can look at your life and you can give yourself a PhD in suffering, which you certainly can. And then the question comes, if you take the PhD in suffering and work with it and make it work for you and transcend, then it's all been worthwhile. But for many people, they don't manage to transcend because we don't actually work with people. If battered children grow up to repeat the pattern, we just punish them. We put them in jails or mental hospitals. Right. And I had a therapeutic community for 12 years because it is a treatable condition.
Right. And that's pretty much what I did. From my early adult years up into my 30s, most of my work was done in communities with damaged people. I was a program specialist at a youth community center in North Minneapolis, where I dealt with a lot of hurting young people. I was a correctional counselor for about 5 years, for about 2 years at a correctional halfway house. I was an assistant chaplain at a juvenile correctional facility, and specifically worked in a cottage with young men who were sexually abused and who had sexually abused people themselves. And so a lot of my work was in the vein of working with hurting and damaged people. I worked for about 5 years with people who were developmentally disabled and mentally challenged. So a lot of my work was with other hurting people early on.
Can I ask you a question, Ed?
But it came later on in my life.
Ed?
Yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay. What I wanted to ask you, with the children that were sexually abused, the boys, did you also find that it wasn't just the fathers or males that were sexually abused, but also women? Because I found that in the refuge. Because that's the big subject that nobody talks about. Incest with mothers and sons. And to me, it's the most dangerous incest of all.
Yes.
And I remember
I saw as well.
And as we know,
was the lecherous male. The character of the lecherous male is what's implanted in our minds when we talk about sexual abuse against children. But no, that's not, no. And the headlines are starting to tell the story now. When we look at the school teachers, a lot of females in the news now, having sex with underage students, having sex with their students. So the headlines are starting to tell the story that some of us knew all along.
Well, the two big stories, I think, Ed, of this century, or the last 50 years, one is the biggest lie of all, which is the patriarchy, i.e. all men are violent and abusive towards women. That's the biggest lie of all. And the second biggest lie is that women are not pedophiles, where they certainly are. And that if we stopped sexual abuse of our children, we would not have pedophiles, because the majority of pedophiles are abused in early childhood. But because no one wants to look at men and men's issues, all this adoration of women actually takes up all the oxygen.
Yeah. Well, the women's movement, or as I look at the modern feminist movement, they've won the PR battle. Even though they don't have a lot of the statistics on their side, they've won the PR battle. So when you don't have the statistics on your side and you're not planning on being honest, the one thing you have to do is win the PR battle. And this is essentially what they've done. They've won the PR battle. They've gotten their seat into places where we, as men who know the truth, and women who know the truth and are willing to speak truth to power about men's issues, we don't have our foot in those doors. And so they've won the PR battle, even though when you look at the data, when I wrote in my piece, the first piece before I wrote about my personal experience, Woman as Aggressor, and I talked about the 286 scholarly investigations, when I talked about the 221 empirical studies, when I talked about the 65 analysis and reviews that all point to the same thing, that women are as violent or more violent in relationships than men are, that's called a statistical avalanche. That means get out of the way of the data. So we know the truth about this. You first brought this out in the 70s yourself, when you started doing your work. Yeah. And it's gone on from there. And we still are losing the PR battle, even though the scholarly work, the empirical evidence points in a totally different direction than what the PR people are saying in the women's movement.
But listen, Ed, and see if you agree with this, because it's a very interesting thought, and I've been talking about this to everybody I can. I think behind all this is the policy, for instance, that our Labour Party were advised to adopt, where our Minister for Women, Harriet Harman, actually said that marriage was a dangerous place for women and children, and men are not naturally harmonious in the family. Now, when you have that policy driving, and it's an anti-family policy, which actually has been with us since the early days of Marxism, because what the plan was that you destroy the family by taking the men out of the family. And as she said in this policy paper, she said the new family unit will be women and children. Now, that's been driving across the Western world. And this is why, how, go on. Go ahead.
I see that as well. I see that happening as well. And part of, you can look at the black community in America and point that as well, too, because that lie was being told to us before it was put into the general population. That we will give you X amount of dollars if the man isn't there. Yeah. If he's not part of the family, if he's not in the home. And so I've always said, look, if you look at how communities that have been under siege in a country or in a society, keep your eye on that, because that will be soon spreading to all communities. And because we didn't keep our eye because it was just those people went through that. Well, now all men are starting to see that, wait a minute, this thing is starting to cross over the line and have the pendulum has swung in a certain direction now. And so because we didn't keep our eye on the ball when certain groups were being treated like that, and when certain men in certain groups were being treated like that, now we see that the society as a whole has been infected in the same way, with the same ideology. And so it behooves us to keep our eye on the ball. I think the title, When Did You Wake Up, is appropriate, because we have been sleeping. We have been in a deep slumber. We have been in a deep sleep. One of my problems was when this whole Ray Rice thing took off in the NFL and domestic violence and that sort of thing, I was wondering, okay, where's our response team? Where's the response team that talks about, wait a minute, we have to deal with this domestic violence thing holistically. We can't just look at it as a gender-specific problem. We didn't have those people. But the people who say it's just a male problem, they had their foot in the door already. And we have to give our response.
If I can interrupt you both for anybody who's listening and doesn't follow American football, Ray Rice was an American football player, who got caught on tape, in an altercation with his fiancée, now wife. And to cut a long story short, they were fighting, and he ended the fight with a slug to her face, and she was knocked out. We can go into a lot more about that, but that has been exploited by the so-called women's movement to force the National Football League in America to put every player through domestic violence training through the Duluth model, amongst other things. Just wanted to get out there.
Coach, every general manager, all NFL personnel, not just the players. So that's when it really becomes policy, when your GM and your coaches have to go through it too. And so that's what's going on with that model as well too. It's not just the players; it's the GM and the coaches that have to go through it as well too.
But it's a known fact, isn't it, Ed, that the Duluth model has actually produced nothing of any consequence.
Nothing.
It is a damaging, terrible, terrible indictment of the people who use it and insist on using it, because essentially it brands all males, all men of all sorts, as batterers and rapists. And that, to me, and then to actually force men into those programs and make them pay to be actually abused. It is an abusive model, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it's mandated emasculation is what it is. and so we see that happening over and over again. And when a model doesn't produce anything, I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but it means that it's not working. So if you're using this model continually, the only thing I can think of, and you said this before, Erin, that it comes down to being about the money too.
Yeah.
How do we get the funds? You get a lot of funds. You get a lot of grant money by putting forth this Duluth model, even though it hasn't worked. And it's one of the few fields, because I worked in the nonprofit world for some time. It's one of the few fields when we talk about this whole domestic violence training thing where you don't have to show any results in order to keep getting the money.
But you don't.
You don't have to prove that your policy is working. You don't have to prove that your approach or your strategy or your methodology is working, because they never answer those. They really don't.
Ed, can I add?
Yeah.
That also, the same thing applies to your shelters. There is no actual evidence of any sort that the shelters have made any difference to the cycle of violence. There are no records of how many women have gone back or gone on to make even more violent relationships. Nothing.
Exactly.
And it's completely unaccountable. And there's billions of dollars going into that. But I wanted to go back and talk to you, because you're on the forefront, you're at the coalface of this movement. I wanted to ask you, tell me, because I have always been gobsmacked. I don't know if you say that in America, but you say it in England. Gobsmacked to find that men have not united till far too late to ever fight back on this issue. Where are they?
Well, I don't know where they are. I don't have an answer to that question. I really don't.
Well,
I wish I had a more, but I don't. Yeah, I know. But what I'm saying, those are, we have pockets of that. We still haven't crossed over into having the sort of combined effort that I believe is necessary in order to really affect change. And what I mean by that is that I'll be perfectly honest. I didn't know anything about A Voice to Men until, like, I say a couple of months ago. I knew absolutely, and I'm not saying that's A Voice for Men's fault or that A Voice for Men didn't do what they needed to do to get the word out. I'm just saying that that's the reality, is that there are a lot of segmented groups in their different corners doing their thing, and they never seem to come together as a united whole.
Actually, Ed,
hang on
a minute, Ed. Dean wants to say something, then I want to say something. So you go ahead, Dean.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify. I don't want to say that A Voice for Men is that source. I believe that A Voice for Men is the start of. We're attempting to be the source to start that process happening. I believe we're at the start of that happening. We're not going to be all things to all people, but we're hoping through A Voice. We can't. That can't be done. But
no.
We're hoping that one of our missions is to get that very mission rolling. So that's all I wanted to say there.
I agree, Dean. And I think I found A Voice for Men actually online several years ago. And immediately that I had been waiting for that voice for nearly 50 years. That's the tragedy of it. As I watched men's group after men's group after men's group fold. And it was when I was at the Detroit conference. I think you were there, weren't you? Weren't you, Ed?
Oh, no. Like I said, and I talked to Dean about this earlier. There's I've just been diagnosed with a disease that's pretty rare and pretty debilitating.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And it's called EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Wow.
And it's made traveling for me sometimes a difficult thing.
Well, thank God for Skype. Anyway, Ed, you know what? When we were standing on the platform with, and it was Ann Cools from Canada. She's the only black person in the Senate. And
I've seen her.
I've known her for years. We're great friends. She was standing next to me. There were 3 of us women, and the others were men on this platform. And that was one of the most probably powerful moments in the history of the men's movement. And it will always be remembered because the atmosphere in that hall was electric. And many men said it felt like coming home. Because one of the problems for men is how isolated they are. Because one of the difficulties, men are trained to actually channel all their emotions first through their mothers and then through their partners. So when that all falls away, they don't have each other.
Right. We're taught to be solitary creatures. We really are. We're taught to be the stoic, keep it all inside, never quote unquote complain, stiff upper lip. Even with your best friends, there's certain things that are, it's an unwritten rule you just don't talk about. And so all those things lend itself to us being fragmented in that way until we start to challenge that particular narrative about ourselves. Then I think we're going to continue to have the problem of not being able to come together. That narrative, first and foremost, has to be challenged. And that's why I wrote what I wrote when it came to my personal story, that if it's going to be challenged, then those of us who have experienced certain things, we have to be forthright. We have to say it. We have to express it, because that's the beginning of it all, is that when you start to shed those narratives, those things that have been said about you as a man, and when you start to speak the truth about your experience, it gives the opportunity. I can't tell you how many other men have commented and said, thank you so much. I appreciate what you wrote. I mean, I believe that's how you started. We have to step forward and say, look, because that's how the story of women are told. Their personal narrative has trumped ours because they're willing to talk about it. And we haven't been willing to talk about it. Yeah. And that's how you begin to change this PR campaign, because that is a part of it. PR, public relations, is a part of it. And we have to
also, Ed, we have to keep reminding the public that it's child abuse. The figures for women abusing children is far higher than for natural fathers. Actually, the safest place for a child is with his biological father. And this is information we don't get out. And the problem, too, is it interests me in that my experience all the way through, and I've 40 years now working in violent families, where the mother is violent and damaging, girls do not get as damaged. They're certainly damaged, but boys are so vulnerable to that abuse. And when I got told by the feminist movement, look at the jails, there are only 4,000 women in jail and the rest are all men, my argument was exactly that. It's not because the men are actually more venal than women. It's because they are far more badly damaged. At the end of the day, you were able to climb out of your pit because you were loved. You knew you were loved, and your closest bond was your grandmother.
Yeah,
but for a child to grow up and have to come to the conclusion, the pain is so great when somebody has to accept that their mothering was unable to mother and their father was unable to father. But it's the mothering person who carried you for 9 months, gave birth to you, and then rejected you. And that hole is very hard to fill. I call that primary pain. And a lot of people, they never ever come to terms with that primary pain. And in order to stay away from that pain, what they will do is go to drugs, drink, relationships, drama, anything, not to face the fact that they weren't loved.
Yeah. We become addicted to dysfunction, so to speak.
Well, it keeps you away from the pain. As long as you're busy.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to ask you, was there any point when your mother actually ever put a hand out to you, or you felt that she was actually trying to make any kind of reparation.
Well, but the same thing would creep out, the same attitude and dismissiveness of who I am, of my experience when it came to our relationship. There was a dismissiveness, but there was something I wrote in the piece, the same piece that's on A Voice of Men that appears on Men Press News. There was a part of it that doesn't appear on A Voice to Men, that does appear in Men Press News, and I'll read it. It says, "From my mother, I inherited my looks, the foundation of my sense of humor, and my work ethic. Before she fell sick, she could be a tireless worker. She was capable of genuine acts of kindness. She could be charming and downright gregarious. There were flashes of the better mother in person she could have been toward me. Those flashes, however, were greatly offset by an overall hostility, indifference to the pain inflicted, and rage. And at the end of the day, that's the most brutal triumph of the abuse. In the abuser, there can be an authentically better person that just doesn't completely surface. So the child can't trust their smile because too many times that smile is followed by a cruel snarl. The child can't believe in their loving touch because they know all too well the sting of the abusive blows that same hand can deliver." So that's what.
Truth.
So that's the dynamic. They reach out the hand at times, and that's what makes it so much more so much more frustrating. Is because they reach out the hand at times, and they can show that they have this genuine, authentic person inside that's capable of kindness. But then in a moment, and I guess you could say amen to this too, Erin, in a moment, that charm could turn into rage. Mm-hmm. In a moment, that rage could, that smile can turn into hostility. In just a moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the other problem is you're what I call the onlooker. I was the onlooker with my mother's relationship to the other two children. And in a sense, one of the problems with the relationship with the other two children, and particularly with my brother, was that the only way she was prepared to tolerate him is if he was in total, almost like she used him as a security blanket. So as long as he didn't develop any personality of his own, he was safe with her. But like any good Narcissus, if you just needed to touch the rage, and then you were in a very great deal of danger. Because I know the rage inside my mother, which her mother died in childbirth, and she was very seriously abused by her stepmother.
Right.
But of course, one of the things that abusive people very often can't do it, isn't that they don't know how to do it. They can't tell you what happened. So you learn these things after they're dead, and you cannot negotiate with a corpse, which is why I urge everyone who has come from an abusive background to work hard on it before the parent or both parents have passed.
Yeah. Yeah. You're so right about that, Erin. That's so true. I had the opportunity to talk to my biological father once in my life. And that was when I was in my, late 30s. The first time I talked to him, the only time I talked to him, and it didn't go well. Well, 3 years ago, he died. And and I went through a period, and I was trying to figure out, why do I miss a man I didn't even know? Well, as you said, you can't negotiate with a corpse.
Yeah.
You can't. There are unresolved things that only he could answer for me. Only he could give me those answers. No one else can. People can give you secondhand information, but it's not the same. It needed to come from him, and it didn't. I dealt with that. My wife was a wonderful help in that. My faith is the foundation for that. Yeah. And was able to come through that. I really was. But it had all happened all at once. My foster mother, my younger brother, and my biological father all died within months of each other 3 years ago. And so it was, there are a lot of things that I didn't get to talk to him about, when it came to our childhood. But it was told to me, like I said, secondhand, that he had got into an argument with my mother, and he told her, you know, you prevented me from being able to have a relationship with my brother, and he really wanted to help me. He really wanted to help me, and he tried to help me, but wouldn't allow that. And there was a time where I was going to take him to live with me, but that got blown up, and then his life slowly, I mean, not slowly, but I mean, accelerated into deterioration after that. So, you know, we can't negotiate with corpse. And you're right. If you need to get things straight, the time to do it is while they're still breathing, while they're still above the ground, if you can. Now, some people won't allow you to do that, and maybe they'll never give you the answer. But you owe it to yourself, and you owe it to your own personal healing, and for the people around you as well, too, for your own children, if you have them, to get those answers, to get to at least try to.
And the other thing, too, is the more information you have as to why your parents were so abusive, the better you're able, at times, the real test, I think, of somebody who's transcended is they can look back with passion and and pity on the parents that were unable to love because they couldn't love themselves, let alone love their children. And I think we need to move forwards now. Instead of what's happening in England, I don't know about you, but my experience here is what's happening is that they're taking away children from these mothers who can't mother when they should be taking the mothers in so that they can mother the children. Then people say to me, oh, well, about the fathers. Well, unfortunately, many of these mothers and young people or men and women, they have no concept of a relationship. So many of the women, the men in the children's lives are basically one-night stands. And so the children are left high and dry, and the answer isn't to take them away because she'll replace them. The answer, and this is probably why I founded the shelter movement. I wanted a place where I could help my mother, because one of the problems is, and you're probably the same, I became my mother's carer because I defended her against my father. And in doing that, I lost my childhood because I was busy mothering my mother and my siblings.
Yeah, well, that's where a lot of my childhood when I was fathering my little brother.
Yeah,
that's what I was. I was changing diapers. I was, rocking him to sleep. I mean, we were extremely close when we were younger. But the toxicity of the relationship he had with my mother helped to deteriorate the relationship I had with him even. So I wasn't so much my mother's protector mothering her, but I was fathering my younger brother a lot.
It must have been so painful for you when he died. Must have been awful.
It was, and I'll tell you, it's 3 years removed, and I still haven't fully comprehended or grasped that loss yet. It's still a process right now. I don't think I fully grasp 32 years old. He had children, and he's gone. I mean, just like that, gone.
Well, when you're a carer like that, and that is what a lot of us who grew up with abuse, we become tenderers or carers, even sometimes caring for people we shouldn't. Maybe that's what gets us in trouble, but that's almost like your brother. In many ways, I'm sure in many ways your brother felt like your son.
At times, yeah.
Because of that, you're feeding him and cuddling him and changing his diaper and such.
Well, my grandmother used to tell my mother. My grandmother was a pretty blunt, straightforward woman. She said, I've watched your son with your other son. I've watched Herschel with your son. They call me Eddie, with Eddie. And when it's just the two of them, and it's perfectly fine. She said, and when you show up, that's when Herschel starts to act out. She said, you're his biggest problem. She said it without breaking up. She said, you're his biggest problem. That's what she told my mother when it came to my brother Herschel. So you're his biggest problem. And so,
yes, but
it was a very toxic. And now,
when you say toxic, can I ask you something? When you're saying toxic, was it an inappropriate relationship?
No, I wouldn't call it inappropriate in the sense of, anything untoward going on, whether it be sexually or anything like that.
But emotionally, because she wouldn't.
But emotionally, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in his young mind, the fact that he appeared on the surface to be treated better than I was, that he was allowed to get away with things that I would have been killed for. When he saw this, he began to feed into that. And so when you talk about the narcissistic makeup of certain abusive mothers, well, he began to, begin to present those symptoms as well of narcissism, because she fed into that. She gave him that. And so in that regard, yeah, emotionally it was, I would call, inappropriate. It was inappropriate because there was never the other side of love, which I call boundaries. Okay? There weren't boundaries. And some people that, boundaries has nothing to do with love. Well, yeah, it does. Boundaries are part of love. And that's what he was never given. And that's why he was always in trouble with other people, because other people had boundaries, And if other people didn't have boundaries, the state of Illinois had boundaries,
But
the Chicago Police Department had boundaries.
Yeah, but also Ed, the other problem for him was that she wouldn't let him pull away in order to discover himself as a man.
Exactly.
She kept him as a man-child.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why how men in single parent, and I've been a single parent. I know the problem because I had a son. But the single parent mother cannot father a child. And what are we doing as a whole society as we displace men completely out of our schools, out of hope that now that they're busy trying to push men out of the universities. So essentially, as everything becomes feminized, boy children have only one model, and that is to become feminized themselves. And that's where the rage comes in. Yeah. Now,
and along with the feminization, as you say, of men, is the flip side of the criminalization of being a man, where being a male is basically criminalized.
Yeah.
Being a man, just your existence as a male is a problem that needs to be solved. And as soon, or a threat that needs to be dealt with. You being just a male, period. Don't have to be guilty of any inappropriate behavior. You don't have to be committing a crime. Just your existence as a male is a threat. And what do we do with threats? We either neutralize the threat or we eliminate the threat. So that's how we've been treated as men in these so many years now, is that being a man is essentially criminalized. It's essentially demonized, and you are viewed as a threat from the time you are born as a man. And so, as I said, what do you do with a threat? You either neutralize the threat or you eliminate the threat. And so the neutralizing part is you have to be feminized as a man. The elimination part is you have to be locked away. You have to be cut off from any sort of meaningful relationship with your children or anything like that. So that's how we deal with males in our society. And it's no coincidence that 60% of the children who die as a result of abuse are males. 60% in our country.
Yeah, that's right.
60%. So to me, that's not a coincidence.
No,
so being a male is basically criminalized and demonized. And so your existence is the problem. Not that you did anything wrong. Just the fact that you exist as a man, as a male, is the problem to some people.
Okay, Ed, we've got 10 more minutes because then we're coming up to the hour. The thing I'd like to ask you about today, I was talking to a very eminent woman historian. She lives in England and works here. And I was saying to her, there is no part I can find anywhere in the history of anything like this happening between men and women anywhere. And she agreed. She said this is really the first time that this gender war that has been being fought for the last 50 years has almost destroyed the fabric of the Western world. And other people would laugh at me and say I'm paranoid and I'm making it up, but I'm not.
No, there's too much. You cannot be viewed as paranoid when there's so much data on the side of your argument.
Yeah.
I don't know how people can call anyone paranoid when there is a literal statistical mountain of data. A mountain of data that says these things are occurring. And then let's throw in the anecdotal personal narratives along with that. And then you got a very startling problem. So no, in my study of history, and I've taught history, in my study of history, I haven't seen anything like this. I haven't seen anything like this at all. I really haven't.
So really, in order to fight back, we're going to have to make it up as we go along. And I'm hoping to see class actions. I'm hoping to see people like Hillary Clinton put in a position where she has to explain why she thinks globalizing feminism is a good idea.
Exactly.
Or that people like Harriet Harman can make hate speeches about men being dangerous to family life, and she can get away with it. And it's a policy. Exactly. It's an actual government policy.
Exactly. So therein lies the problem. I think what we have to learn, as you said, we have to make it up as we go along. What we also have to learn when we're dealing with this radical feminism, what we have to learn how to do as people who are standing on the side of the truth, who are standing on the side of real gender equality, what we have to learn how to say when they trot out all this false data and all this, when they come up with the statistics that they come up with to try to verify and try to justify their attitudes towards men, we have to learn how to say the phrase, I reject the premise. We just have to learn how to say that, I reject the premise. Because what we are constantly being asked to do, and what we're constantly being asked to do, is to take part in a conversation. Is to take part in the conversation where the assumptions are already fixed, the conclusions are already drawn, and the parameters of the dialogue are already set. And so we're being asked to just co-sign what they've written, to co-sign what their ideology is. We're not asked to be part of the dialogue. We're asked to co-sign their ideology is what we're being asked to do. And so you have to change that. You have to become architects of the dialogue yourself. And you have to start by saying, when they trot out all this nonsense, is to say, I reject the premise.
That's very...
I reject your...
insightful.
Go ahead, Dean.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just going to say amen. That is incredibly insightful. That is the truth.
Ed, have you been following the White Ribbon campaign on A Voice for Men?
Yeah.
Have you seen their website? Yes, I have. Have you seen the website? It's brilliant. Dean, give us a précis of what that's about.
Okay, I'll give everybody a shout out about this. Of course, we are being condemned all over the place in the mainstream media, but too bad, because the mainstream media is controlled by gender ideologues and bigots like Joe Filipovic, and some people at Raw Story and a bunch of other places. The White Ribbon campaign is a very shady, in my estimation, charity, nonprofit. They call themselves a charity. I don't think they do any actual charitable work because I've looked at their funding. But they're active in Canada and Australia, and they're trying to go global. They spend almost every penny they get on staff salaries, travel expenses, and almost nothing to help domestic violence victims. And this White Ribbon Foundation does nothing but spread the vile message of, end toxic masculinity and end men's violence toward women and all the usual hateful rubbish that we're aware of, that we all know about, or that everybody in this show should know about. No, domestic violence is a human problem. Violence is a human problem. It's not a racial problem. It's not a gendered problem. It's a human problem. But they spread that toxic message, and they've been growing. And the long and short of it is, one of our friends actually 2 years ago bought a domain called whiteribbon.org, and we didn't even know he had done it, or I think he may have told us and we forgot. But fast forward, we recently discovered that this domain was available. It was gifted to us by a gentleman. We own it now, and we have started whiteribbon.org, a new campaign to raise awareness of domestic and intimate partner violence and child abuse. And we have filled that whiteribbon.org site with facts and information on what intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and child abuse really looks like. In terms of studies, in terms of articles by respected academics, episodes of this radio show or the radio show with Erin, and basically it's there to educate the general public on what the violence and abuse issue really looks like, because we've been lied to about it for 40 years about what it's really about. So if you go to whiteribbon.org, no, it is not a registered charity, nor does it claim to be, although it's not out of the question that we'll make it one. It is an educational page. You know, we may make it into one, but I mean, right now it's just still privately owned, but it is an educational page, whiteribbon.org. Go check it out. It's real information you can verify for yourself that shows how people have been lied to. And the response over the last 48 hours has been enormous. We've gotten screaming rage, backlash, hate from the mainstream media all over the United States and some places outside the United States. And honestly, we don't care. We're also been lied about, and at least one entity I won't name may wind up with a lawsuit on their hands. But in any case, the site, it doesn't matter because the site is there and people are going and they're reading, and we're getting hate mail, but we're getting other people coming in and saying, I had never seen this before.
Yeah, you know, Dean, what would be nice is I'd always wanted to have a T-shirt that actually says, people are not for hitting and men are people too, because that puts it succinctly, because this is where the argument is that men aren't seen or perceived as human.
Right, exactly.
I'm going to run that past Paul.
Okay.
So, anyway, it looks like we're just about out of time.
Yep. This has been fascinating.
Yeah,
it was. It was an honor with you, Erin. It really was. I have appreciated and valued your work in this area. I mean,
and I so appreciate your honesty and also your courage, because this will bring other men forward who also can talk about their damage. And, you know, once you address it, that's when the pain goes away. It's sitting on it.
Yeah.
That it just festers.
Yeah, you rob it of its power when you bring it out into open. Yeah.
Into the light. Anyway, God bless you, Ed.
All right, everybody. And God bless you both. Oh my gosh, 3 people on a Voice for Men who aren't atheists. Our guest today has been Dr. Edward Rhymes, author of When Racism is Law and Prejudice is Policy. Please also see his work on Mint Press. That's mintpress.com, I believe.
Yeah.
And of course, in the show notes, you'll find a link. Mint Press News. Okay. And in the show notes, you'll also see a link to his essay, I Remember Mama, which is must reading. And I'll do the dirty thing and say right here on the air, I hope we get more writing from Dr. Rhymes in the near future on A Voice for Men.
Here.
All right.
Thank you very much, everybody. Next week, Tales from the Infrared will be back, probably talking about Gamergate and Doctor Who. And that's it for this week on When Did You Wake Up? Hey, James, why don't you take us home? You have been listening to When Did You Wake Up with Erin Pizzey. We would like to thank James Huff, Paul Elam, and the A Voice for Men community for their support of this show. If you like what you hear and would like to continue to hear more, donations can be made on the front page of A Voice for Men. That's www.avoiceformen.com. Our theme music is Space 1990B by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. That's INCOMPETECH.com. And is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution License 3.0. And will be noted in the show notes on YouTube. Thank you for listening.